represent their interests because they did not feel that the AAP was adequately representing their interests. As her bio says, she's a practicing vet, but in the last 5 years, she's become an expert witness on behalf of horsemen in many high-profile medication cases, including one with last year's Kentucky Derby winner, Medine Spirit. Most of us know Dr. Tobin, who has been the National HBPA medication advisor for 2 decades. Tom's bio is too long to list, but he is a world-renowned equine toxicologist. And it's my pleasure to introduce someone new to the National HBPA, Dr. Kevin Keegan, who is a veterinary medicine and surgery professor at the University of Missouri. And on topic for today, he's an expert in equine lameness and has been responsible for the creation of a product called Equinosis Q with Lameness Locator, which we're going to discuss today. Could turn out to be revolutionary in the ability to diagnose and find equine lameness.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Mr. Sella and Dr. Daniels and everyone for having us back. The first thing that we want to discuss is only tangentially related to medication, but I thought that this group would benefit from hearing the results of our study, or some of the preliminary results of our study, because the clinical application of the Lameness Locator technology was funded by a number of HBPA organizations and the National HBPA. I can figure out how to use it. Okay, so lameness may occur in racehorses by all of the same mechanisms as horses and other careers. Joint inflammation from OCDs, but the arthritis, juvenile arthritis, a third of yearlings walk through the ring with pre-existing arthritis. Anybody who's tried to buy a horse at the sales understands that. And then, of course, athletic trauma are common causes of lameness. There's your OCD, your arthritis, and of course, the classic oscillants, racehorse oscillants. In racehorses, all of those other things are readily managed with therapeutic medications. They don't put horses at risk of injury, further injury, or severe catastrophic injury. But the one category of lameness, which is the stress fracture, is most important because this category of lameness may progress to catastrophic injury. As you can see from this here, it's pretty subtle, but that's the beginning of a crack in a cannon bone. So this is difficult to image. As I was discussing with Dr. Keegan earlier today, this particular radiograph took about 20 shots in order to actually find this crack. So it's oftentimes they can't be found with conventional imaging. So catastrophic injuries occur at the site of pre-existing stress fractures, which, as I mentioned, are very difficult to find. These horses are typically lame. After a workout, they might be sound the next day. And when I say sound, I mean sound by visual inspection. So our question was, could these injuries be manifested as a subtle lameness or asymmetry of gait? And if we can detect those earlier, can we then identify them earlier and diagnose them earlier? So gait asymmetry or lameness is determined by the difference between their head or pelvic height over a full stride cycle. The difference in, it showed up there. Okay. So head height over a full stride cycle, which is fully load bearing on the left front and the right front. And the same is true of the pelvis. So just in case. You can kind of see my monitor's not showing it as yours, but at least you guys get to see it correct. And then it's also the difference in minimum head height. So the difference in both minimum and maximum head height. So we can measure this using an objective measurement system, which Dr. Keating will talk about more because he developed it. It turns out that the detection, and this is not, I'm better at seeing lameness than you are, but this is just determined by having experienced clinicians evaluate horses for lameness over time. The detection threshold, or the ability of human eyes to see lameness, the horses have to have a 25% difference in minimum or maximum head height over a stride cycle. And subtle lameness can be agreed upon by only about 75% of clinicians, or 75% of the time for front limbs and 67% of the time for hind limbs. Meaning subtle lameness, maybe it's lame, maybe it's not. And this is people who are very good at lameness. The objective measurement of lameness, or using the Lameness Locator Equinosis Q, is it overcomes some of the limitations of human perception. So, for example, this horse's lame right hind, by the way, and this horse's tail being up over his back kind of obscures your ability to tell whether he's lame on one side or the other. So I don't know how many people caught the right hind lameness. Anybody? Probably not. So, you know, we're trying to, most jurisdictions now have practitioners looking at horses before race day, and certainly the regulatory clinicians look at them on race day. You can see that there's a lot of limitations here. So, what we tried to do, and we've done this now on using several different methods. So we did an entire racing season at Mahoney in Ohio, thanks to the Ohio HBPA for contributing and helping us fund that study. And we also have followed some horses from before they were broke as yearlings throughout their racing career, and we're into the 3-year-old year of that study. The longitudinal study of the monthly evaluations will continue until the racing careers is complete, or their ownership is transferred. So I'm going to briefly go over how the Lameness Locator does this. Dr. Keating is a specialist, and I'm going to work through this stuff and let him talk about that. So this is a break plot that is generated by the Lameness Locator technology. So the difference between maximum and minimum head heights over a stride cycle are measured. They are biomechanically related, and therefore they can't be separated into difference in minimum and difference in maximum height. So they're demonstrated as a ray on this plot, and the little red ray is the average of all of the others. The little strides with right front asymmetry are drawn above horizontal, and strides with left front asymmetry are drawn below the horizontal. The detection of the threshold is 8.5. We used what we're going to call serviceably sound, and we don't think this is unique to racehorses. We think this is all horses, meaning that there is some asymmetry variability that's greater than the 8.5, and this is basically the average of all the horses in the screen study that we did in Ohio. The hind limb series are done somewhat differently because the difference in maximal and minimal pelvic height are not interrelated, and so they're put on a separate chart. And we also have a presumptive serviceably sound threshold for the hind limb, and we use 7 millimeters. I'm not going to go into great detail because we have an expert in this seated at the panel here today. So what we did is we took the average front and hind limb symmetry and plotted against time in our case studies. In our longitudinal study, it's time in months. In the study that we did in Ohio, it's time in weeks. And so the plots that you're going to see are the time in months on the bottom, and the region shaded gray is our threshold regions. And so hind limb asymmetry and forelimb asymmetry are going to be on separate plots. So I'm going to go through one interesting case, and then I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Keegan. So this is a 2 to 4-year-old thoroughbred gelding. The big gap between months 1 and 5 is simply because we didn't evaluate him. So he was laid up for a presumptive tibial stress fracture. So the top graph is the forelimb asymmetry measurement, and the second two are diff min and diff max pelvis. The interesting plot for this particular horse is going to be the one in the middle. So for the purposes of this presentation, I would just look at the one in the middle. So we had a presumptive tibial stress fracture. And it was presumptive because we didn't do a bone scan, which is the way that you diagnose a tibial stress fracture. But the horse came up acutely lame, didn't lock to the lower limb, and had no radiographic abnormalities that we could identify. And so it was presumptive tibial stress fracture, and the horse went home. And why we think it's a stress fracture? Well, veterinarians will tell you that any horse that comes up acutely lame after work is a stress fracture until proven otherwise. So those are the horses that we're most concerned about progressing to catastrophic injury. So this horse got 4 months, and then the very first evaluation was done at month 1. So at month 1, there was some asymmetry still, and it was outside our 7 millimeter serviceably sound range. So you can see it's above the gray zone. And if we put him back at work, so this is where the red area shows. He was returned to work because we thought he was sound enough to go back to work. And then we didn't evaluate him with the Lameness Locator for 5 months, but he comes up acutely lame after another work. And so we suspected recurrence of the tibial stress fracture. At this point, we do have radiographs that did show that there was some remodeling consistent with the tibial stress fracture. And this time, we left him off until he was within the serviceably sound threshold. And in my defense, on month 1, we didn't actually know what our thresholds were going to be. And these are still presumptive as we go through our studies. We'll hopefully come up with a better, a more conclusive number. But then you can see that, so at this point, we went to evaluate him almost monthly for the next few months, and he remained sound from month 7 to month 13 with regular works and regular training. So that was supportive of our assumption that we can use this technology to determine when a horse that's on layup can go back into training when it's sound enough to return to training. But then we had a new lameness, which we did work up with blocks, and it turned out that it was, in this case, the right hind foot. In this particular case, we had a negative palmar angle, sclerosis of the navicular bone, because this is a really rare condition in a racehorse, navicular disease of a hindfoot. The treatment was restricted to corrective shoeing. Indicated therapies would be corticosteroid injections of coffin joint and navicular bursa, bisphosphonates, and shockwave. The latter two are effectively banned at this time, so they were not instituted, but those would be the recommended veterinary interventions. And the horse did return successfully to training and finished third with no recurrence of lameness at the race. The horse has now raced since that time up 2 or 3 additional times, and no recurrence of lameness, as long as we keep his feet properly trimmed. So that was the advantage. I'm going to move past these other cases simply because I want to make sure that Dr. Keegan has time. So I have several other cases, but the take-home message is that the equinosis cue has been an effective tool, so the subjective lameness measurement, to determine when a horse is on the way up for an injury can safely return to training. A single lameness examination with the equinosis cue in isolation is not effective as a screening tool to predict injury. We have been able to determine that an objective gait signature can be identified when serial examinations are conducted over time. So you'll notice that that little horse that I had, that I showed you in the first case, still had a consistent right hind asymmetry, but it didn't get worse after we implemented some changes. So we feel that at this point is just how this horse travels. And we need additional cases, and I did have 2 additional cases to show, but don't really have time. And for this part of the study, we have been sponsored by the North American Association of Racetrack Veterinarians, National HBPA, the Equine Health and Welfare Alliance, Indiana, Ohio, and Iowa HBPAs, and these studies are still ongoing, and I think Dr. Keegan is going to discuss the study that went on in Ohio for a number of months during the morning meet. Pass it to Dr. Keegan.
Hello. Thank you. I come from Missouri. We don't have racing in Missouri, which is a shame. They passed the bill in 1983, and we still don't have racing in Missouri. But we have racing in 6 of the 8 states around Missouri. So I'm coming at this from as a little bit of an outsider. Before I presented the data that we collected at the Ohio and Iowa tracks, I think I'm going to first just go over a little bit on how the system that we used was developed, because I think it speaks to the validity of it. Can the results be believed? Do I go forward here? Which one?
Green.
Okay. All right, so the system that we used was developed in the late 1990s at the University of Missouri. It was a collaboration between veterinarians, engineers, data scientists, and it was developed only after we first did investigations to see if something like this would be useful to the profession. And the consensus was that it would be, if we could develop a sensitive measurement of lameness in horses, that it would be beneficial to the profession. So the first, okay, so the monitor is not showing movies, but behind it is. So the first step was to pick a technology. So for instance, should we measure movement, which is what we ended up measuring, or should we try, for instance, measuring ground reaction forces, or something else? And for various reasons, we concentrated or settled on measuring body motion. We thought that the development of measuring ground reaction forces over many contiguous strides, which is necessary to do because lameness is quite variable from stride to stride. The engineering that would be required to do that would just be too high, or the bar would be too high to get over. So we settled on measuring motion. And at the start, we didn't know what to measure, because you could potentially measure many things. For instance, you could measure stride length, you could measure joint angle changes, you could measure how the limbs swing forward or to the side. Many things that veterinarians look at and horsemen look at to detect basically measured everything. We used computer-assisted analysis of gait, put markers all over the horse's body. We used horses with induced lameness. And again, this was a collaboration between engineers, data scientists, and we basically measured everything. Then, using various data mining techniques, we found that vertical displacement, actually vertical position, as Dr. Vander already alluded to, vertical position of the pelvis, vertical position of the head when the horse is trotting is the most sensitive and accurate indicators of lameness in the horse, and which limb is the source of lameness, and also it was sensitive and accurate for indicating the timing of lameness, whether it was hurting the horse coming down on the leg or whether it was hurting the horse pushing off of the leg. So we didn't just wake up one day and decide that we're going to put accelerometers on the head and the pelvis and say, oh, we can measure lameness. We started back in the late 1990s, first trying to figure out if this would be important or useful, and then searching for the best and most sensitive indicators of lameness. So, incidentally, we have tried to do the same thing. So all of this is when the horse is trotting. We've tried to do the same thing for the gallop. We've had a racing study that we induced horses, induced lameness in them and studied them at the trot and also the gallop. And basically what we found out that we can detect lameness at the trot very easily. Very, very minor lameness, very mild lameness, but then we get the horse out on the track and it starts galloping and it just covers it up. So we can't do that very well, and there's some biomechanical reasons for that, but we just cannot detect lameness when the horse goes into the canter or the gallop very well as we can at the trot. So we measure lameness by collecting vertical acceleration of the head and the pelvis, and then this vertical acceleration is converted to position. We put this sensor on the right forelimb. This is a gyroscope, and it measures position of the leg, but that sensor has nothing to do with the amplitude of lameness. It's just a time index marker, and it allows us to determine whether it's right or left. By the way, we can now do this. The information that we get from the right forelimb sensor, we can now do this with the gyroscope on the pelvis to determine footfall pattern. So that would certainly be useful for thoroughbreds at the track, because maybe you don't want to put that right forelimb sensor on. So vertical acceleration is converted to vertical position. By the way, you can't do this with GPS because we need sub-millimeter accuracy in position, and GPS gives you maybe 5 to 10 centimeters. It just would not be accurate enough to do that. So vertical movement of the head in a theoretically not lame horse, and I say not lame instead of sound because the opposite of lame is not lame. Soundness means the horse's respiratory tract, GI tract, everything is good in the horse. But to me, the opposite of lame is not lame. But in a horse that is theoretically perfectly not lame, then the vertical movement of the head and the pelvis, the torso, is going to be like a perfect sine wave. And that pain during the stride cycle, whether it's in one leg or two legs, is a defect that perturbs this perfect motion. And then we measure that disruption in the perfect motion because it becomes asymmetric. And that is the metric of lameness. So as Dr. Finger already alluded to, because of some subtle biomechanical differences in the vertical movement of the head for forelimb lameness compared to the vertical movement of the pelvis for hindlimb lameness, we distill this asymmetry, this measurement of lameness in the forelimb down to a single measure, which we call vector sum. It's a vector sum of the difference in the maximum heights of the head and the difference of the minimum heights of the head. But for the hindlimb lameness, we can't do that. So there's two measures. One is called diff-min pelvis, which is basically the difference in the minimum heights of the pelvis, which occur when the horse is landing on the leg. So that kind of measures the impact component of lameness. And then we have the diff-max pelvis, which measures the force of push-off, basically, and that measures the push-off component of lameness. lines, and you can't separate them. So these are measured for every stride, and then the average over all strides is calculated and displayed on the line as these plots, as Dr. Finger already alluded to. This no point, but the upper right plot, yeah, okay. The upper right plot is the foreland plot. Every blue line is a stride. The length of the line is proportional to the asymmetry. And so long lines all clumped together as an indicator of lameness. So that's the foreland lameness plot. The direction to which the line is pointing is an indication of the side and timing of the lameness. Up is right, down is left. The approximate range that is equivalent to a horse that is judged to have a foreland lameness of 0, so that means no lameness. We have determined to be plus or minus 8.5 centimeters, which is the radius of that gray circle. So any rays outside that are considered abnormal. And then the red line is the average. On the right are the hind limb lameness plots. There is one for the left hind limb, which is on the left, and there's one for the right hind limb, which is on the right. Red lines up indicate decreased rise of the pelvis, which is the push-off lameness. So this horse is pushing off less hard on the left hind. Green lines down indicate lack of fall or decreased fall of the pelvis. And the approximate threshold for a horse that is considered not to be lameness for these measures is plus or minus 3 millimeters. So these thresholds that we have established, plus or minus 8.5 for forelimb lameness, plus or minus 3 for hindlimb lameness, those are purposely sensitive thresholds. We make them sensitive because we don't want false negatives in horses that are coming in with a complaint of lameness. We don't want to miss it. So we realize, however, that many horses that don't have pathology, they don't have any disease, they don't have anything wrong with them, are going to exceed this threshold for at least one of these three measures, at least sometimes. So a more appropriate threshold for these studies, which Dr. Finger has already alluded to, for instance, a general screening of large numbers of horses that don't have the existing complaint of lameness we established as 18 millimeters for vector sum and minus 7. I think I have on the slide 6, but it was 7 millimeters for both diff max pelvis and diff mid pelvis. So on the right there is what a not lame horse would look like. I'm sorry, there's that horse would have an impact lameness on the right hind. This is what a normal horse would look like. There's no accumulation of rays in any quadrant, and most of the rays do not go outside the thresholds. So that's just the system in detail. Okay. So I'm now going to present the results of the study, which was supported by the HBPA, Ohio HBPA. So data has now been collected at 2 Ohio racetracks on 73 horses over 16 weeks of racing, and then also at one Iowa racetrack on 36 horses over 18 weeks of racing. 79 of these horses were evaluated at least 5 times throughout the meet. All horses were evaluated with the handler trotting beside the horse on the lead shank, and care was taken to collect a lot of strides. Back-to-back trials were done, and then all the evaluations, this is important to understand, all the evaluations were done during the week, between races, between training sessions. First take-home message from this data collection that we have done is that measured lameness with these thresholds that we're using in actively racing thoroughbreds is common. It's a common thing. And then using these serviceably sound thresholds of 18 millimeters for vector sum, 6 millimeters or 7 millimeters for the hind limb lameness measures, many horses will measure with at least one of these outside of those thresholds. So it's a characteristic of the type and use of this horse, of this type of horse. So now I'm going to show data that were collected in the Ohio study of their lameness measures throughout the study. And so it's going to take a little bit of orientation of these graphs. The x-axis, the horizontal axis, is time in weeks. Okay, the y-axis, and there's 3 axes, are the lameness measures. The top one is the vector sum for forelimb lameness. That's the uppermost plot. The middle plot is the diff max pelvis, which is the push-up component of hindlimb lameness, and then the lower plot is the diff min pelvis, which is the impact component of hindlimb lameness. Each horse's measurement is displayed as either a little blue dot there or the big red dot, red circle, which I'll explain what the red circle is in a little bit, and then it's connected by the blue line. So that's the individual horse's measurement throughout the study, and it is plotted over the background of all the horses that were, of all the measurements of all the horses that were collected in the study. You notice that each one of the vertical axes has a 0, and that is a 0 horizontal line, and measurements above that 0 indicate right involvement, and measurements below that line indicate left. I've also put these vertical blue lines in there as the date that the horse raced, and at the bottom is the finishing position, the speed index for the race. I've also dropped in medications. So, for instance, this horse had its hocks injected, I think, after week 12, or between week 12 and 13. So, what are the big red dots? The big red dots is each lameness measurement that was outside of these previously mentioned thresholds. So, this, say, the horse measured with a lameness. Okay, and I'm going to go through. I'm going to go through 5 horses here real quick. Look at all the red dots. Okay, there's the 3rd horse, of course. Look at all the red dots. The 4th horse, the 5th horse. So you see, there's a lot of red dots. So there's a lot of red dots. So it's common to measure the thoroughbred racehorse, at least at these tracks. They have one measure out, at least one of the measures outside of the threshold. So let's look at this first horse. So make sure I'm looking at chest. So this horse, yes, I got the right one, had every diff max pelvis measurement, so it's a push-up component of hindlimb lameness, outside of the threshold after week 9. So this horse measured with a left hindlimb lameness on every time it was evaluated after week 9. Okay. Here's a horse that had 3 consecutive measurements of right forelimb lameness between weeks 9 and 12, and then the horse returned to baseline. Okay. So the upper plot there, you see there's 3 red circles in a row, and then it went away. Here's a horse in which almost every measurement indicated a right forelimb lameness. Look at the top plot, there's a lot of red dots. Sometimes it had a right hindlimb lameness with it, and sometimes it didn't. But there's also times when the horse measures perfectly normal. Okay, here's a horse that started out at week 1, and look at the bottom plot, there's a red dot way down at the bottom. Had a strong left hindlimb lameness at week 1. Then it switched to a very strong right hindlimb lameness in weeks 2 through 4. It maintained this right hindlimb lameness up to and including week 12, and during which time it didn't race. Maybe that's because it measured with the right hindlimb lameness. But then it switched over to left hindlimb lameness, but it was actually below threshold for the remainder of the study. And here's a horse that maintained a left hindlimb lameness throughout most of the study. It had its front ankles injected, and then it measured with no lameness anyway, so go figure that one out. So the horse had front lameness treated, and the hindlimb lameness went away. So in fact, at least in this Ohio study, using these previously mentioned thresholds, which is 18 millimeters for vector sum for forelimb lameness, plus or minus 7 millimeters for the hindlimb lameness measures, and you look at the middle column of that table, over half, 56.2% of the trials collected had at least one of those 3 lameness measurements outside this threshold. So over half of the trials had at least one of those measures outside the threshold. So to give you an appreciation for how lame this is overall, or how common this is overall, what I've done on the right column there is I've also, I took 100 randomly selected horses that came into our clinic with a history or complaint of lameness or poor performance, and compared to that group, and about the same, 56.7%. So thoroughbred racehorses, in between races, as a whole, at least at these two tracks in Ohio, measured with lameness about as often as one would expect horses that are presented to a clinic for examination of lameness. The Iowa study was a little bit less, only 35.2% of the trials measured were above this threshold. So fortunately for the horses and racing, but unfortunately for trying to determine cause and effect between lameness and catastrophic breakdown, there was only one horse in the Ohio study, and it actually happened after the study, so only one horse in the Ohio and Iowa collections that actually suffered a catastrophic breakdown. And that was this horse here. So if you noticed, it measured intermittently with a combined right forelimb lameness, and it has a contralateral left hind lameness. We know that's contralateral because it's a lack of push-off. Horses push off less hard on the contralateral hind limb when they have a primary forelimb lameness. So it had its front limbs ankled about 1 week after the end of the study. It raced 3 more times over the next 2.5 months, and then it suffered a bilateral mid-body sesamoid fracture in the first turn of the race, catastrophic musculoskeletal injury, but it was in the left front and not the right front in which the horse had measured lameness. So you see the relationship between lameness and injury is not a very simple one. I like to show this model here because if one was going to make up a causal model to determine what the relation or what causes catastrophic musculoskeletal injuries, we know that there's extra horse factors like racetrack surface, but we think that there is a relationship between pre-existing injury and catastrophic musculoskeletal injury, but we don't know about lameness. We don't know if lameness is a simple proxy measurement for pre-existing injury, or if it itself is a direct mediator. Maybe lameness itself, because the horse had that right forelimb lameness and it broke down in the left leg. So we don't know these things. We don't know if lameness is a proxy measurement for catastrophic injury or itself is a mediator. So it's very easy to claim retrospectively, after the fact, that this intermittent lameness pattern that we found in this horse that broke down, it would predict the doom of catastrophic musculoskeletal injury. And if we only knew this ahead of time, then we could have prevented this. But that's really cherry picking. Here's that horse that broke down, and it shows the intermittent right forelimb lameness, and you can tell in the video that the horse is pretty off in the right forelimb. But look at this horse. Okay, here's a horse that had similar measurement history as that horse, but then after the study, it went on to race successfully and very well 18 times and had no incident. So you can't cherry pick like that and say, oh, we know what the lameness signature is right now. We need more data to determine that. So to summarize, I can wrap it up here. It's common for active thoroughbred racehorses to measure with lameness during the week in between races, and you would expect that anyway. And measuring thoroughbred racehorses for lameness on a one-time basis, as Dr. Finger already alluded to, for the purposes of screening whether or not the horse is healthy or fit enough to race, is just going to falsely exclude too many entries, and it's not correct. It's especially not good to do this on the day of the race when there's a lot going on. The horse is excited, everybody's excited. There's not enough time to properly evaluate the meaning and of the measurement. Instead, it makes more sense to regularly evaluate by measurement in between racing and training days when the lameness is more likely to be expressed and there's time time to properly evaluate that measurement, and that's commonly going to be with a very good physical examination and good quality imaging. And it's here where I start to make my pitch for scanning CT. And I think to me that's the most likely imaging modality that could be adopted because it's, of course, doesn't have to be anesthetized. The scan takes like 30 seconds to a minute, and it's much more sensitive than radiography. So it remains that we still, as a profession, we haven't identified those patterns of lameness that are associated with future injury, but this is going to take collecting more data. And it's also not going to be a simple one-size-fits-all assessment. It's going to be a complex equation. It's going to take into consideration level, quality of the horse, multiple factors like class of race, track surface, previous history on the vets list. So I'm going to wrap it up by trying to dispel some of the critical misunderstandings, I think. I refer to them as measurophobias on measuring horses for lameness with inertial sensors. So the first phobia, and I think it's a combination of fear and pride in veterinarians, is that I don't need to measure lameness because I'm so good at picking it up subjectively. I don't think this is true, but it's totally missing the point. First of all, inertial sensors are more sensitive. And they're also resistant to bias for subjective evaluation. But this is not the reason why one should measure lameness. Okay? Measuring lameness confirms what we already think. It increases our confidence in the subjective evaluation. It can protect against mistake because of unavoidable distraction. But it creates this quantitative record that can be stored and also transmitted between individuals. It makes comparisons between dates more accurate. It can help decipher this complex relationship between primary lameness, compensatory lameness, secondary lameness. But most importantly, it creates this subjective database that we can later on search and analyze for patterns that, if we knew what they are, would be useful. So I think it would advance our profession. There's this wonderful article in the Scientific American. To get an article published in the Scientific American, it has to be very good. Why, at least in the human profession, why doctors reject tools that make their job easier. And it uses this historical review about the thermometer. When the thermometer first came out, doctors didn't want to use the thermometer because they could tell that by putting the hand to the head that the person had a fever. Why the heck would I want a thermometer? Okay. So it's a good read if you want to go. There's a link to the article. It's a very good article. The second phobia that's just too difficult to get the data. And veterinarians don't have enough time to do this, but it only takes a few minutes. Actually, it takes 2 minutes, even when you're taking the time to measure the horse. What takes the effort is trotting the horse back and forth. But this is what we normally do when we do a good lameness evaluation. I mean, it could be that thoroughbreds are just too rank and difficult, and it's not going to work. But this is not what we find. I mean, a lot of horses are rank and difficult. Thoroughbreds are not the exception. Perhaps you do need a more experienced person trotting a horse back and forth. But as I said earlier, you could collect the horse when you could collect the data when the horse is out on the track, trotting in the saddle, when maybe going out to train anyway. And as I said before, you can remove that right forelimb sensor and establish football sequence by the pelvic accelerometer. It might be more relevant to instead evaluate the horses out on the track jogging. The added weight of the jockey can bring out the lameness. There's increased ability to control excited horses, and also you can get many strides, and all make this way of data collection more attractive. The range, power, wireless connectivity that is in the sensors, it can all accommodate this type of measurement. And then the last phobia that I would like to address is that this method of measurement of lameness, which detects asymmetry, is not going to detect bilateral lameness, which I know is common in thoroughbreds. So although in theory to bilateral lameness is difficult, more difficult, but it also is more difficult subjectively. It's not true in practice. It's a straw man argument. It's a weak argument. It's more likely that you're going to pick up a bilateral lameness by measuring it. Critics say that bilateral lameness is going to be the same in each leg on every stride over all the time, but that hardly ever happens. Hardly ever happens. Lameness is not that constant. In fact, it's quite variable. And if you're measuring many strides, sooner or later this asymmetry is going to be detected. Sometimes bilateral lameness can show itself by switching between right and left limbs in the same trial, sometimes at different dates. Of course, you can lateralize the lameness by moving the horse in a circle. So this is the last slide. I'm sorry, this is the slide I should have had up when I was talking about bilateral lameness. You can detect bilateral lameness by measuring asymmetry. This is my message. Lameness can be measured accurately and sensitively with body-mounted inertial sensors without much interference in the normal regimen of racing and training. And measuring lameness adds benefit because it takes away doubt, it takes away differences of opinion. It's better than eyeballing it. Objective data from large numbers of horses can be collected, saved, and studied. The question of whether or not measuring lameness can help minimize the incidence of catastrophic racing injuries, we don't know the answer to that yet. But you could study it. You have to study it in order to determine that. And then the last, I need to thank the supporters of these studies, the Ohio HBPA, NARV, Indiana HBPA, and EHWA. And then this is my last, in my opinion, this is the most likely method of routine imaging of horses at the racetrack. And now have standing CT. You don't have to anesthetize the horse. You simply walk the horse up. You can do a complete CD of the front legs and the hind legs in 1 minute. You don't have to anesthetize the horse. I suspect in 10, 15 years, this is what's going to be in almost every racetrack around the country for scanning horses with pre-existing injury. We're trying to get one of these standing CTs in Missouri. It looks like we're going to get it, but I know it's pretty far away from Oregon. But to me, this is the future of scanning racehorses to try to prevent catastrophic musculoskeletal injury.
Thank you, Dr. Keegan. Obviously a vital topic for horsemen. Not an easy topic, very technical. I'm glad everybody was listening intently because we've got a short written presentation after the third race at Oaklawn today just to see how much you were telling Brad that Dr. Keegan recommended. So the winner gets a prize, so come and see me. Dr. Diller.
Yes, I'm gonna use Dr. Keegan's presentation as a segue into where our next discussion is about HISA or HISA, and the HISA medication policies. Now, they have not yet submitted these to the FTC, so we don't know what the final version is. However, the draft proposal from the Horse Racing Authority is up. And just, for curiousness, everybody understands what the red circles meant on Dr. Keegan's presentation? Come on, raise your hands. Okay, all right. So that was detectable lameness. Incidentally, that was between races. So that means that the horses were evaluated for lameness. These are not horses that were racing on that day. As it currently stands, a lot of jurisdictions have this. State vet sees a horse, it's lame, it goes on the vet list. They get it off the vet list, the horse races, the horse is lame, it goes back on the vet list. Gets off the vet list. Horse races, horse is lame, goes back on the vet list, and now it's banned for life, okay? I kind of get that, right? So something's really wrong if it's that lame. In the HISA regulations, if I'm a veterinarian and I stuck this Lameness Locator on a horse in between races, if I identify using all of this technology or not using the technology, just watching the horse go. But the horse is not in, it's not in to go. If I identify that, I have to turn that information in to the authority. The authority puts it into a database. On the third time that the horse gets a red circle, the horse is banned from racing for life. So that's what the current draft proposal for HISA in the medication and in the safety regulations state. So if you step on a rock left front, and I stick my Lameness Locator on and he's lame, and we pack his foot, we give him some time, we pull the shoe or we reshoe him, and then he goes out and he steps on a rock with the right hind, and now he's lame, and we just did the same thing. That happens 3 times, he's banned for life. So buckle up, boys and girls. So what we did was, myself, Dr. Brewer, the attorney Pete Sakopoulos, and Dr. Tobin went through whatever the recent draft is for HISA and just identified things of concern. As presented, there's sections 1 through 24. None of these things are actually submitted to the FTC, so we don't know how long, what they're going to end up like. The only thing submitted is the Racetrack Safety Program, Section 2000. And not all the numbers line up, so we don't know what they're working on, what their drafts are, but we just know what's up today. And we're going to focus on the anti-doping and medication control protocol that is not yet submitted. There's 24 sections. They start with their definitions and their anti-doping and medication control rule violations, and the prohibited list, which is what we're going to probably somewhat focus into. Section 2 of the HISA regulations are the anti-doping and medication control rule violations. It specifies the circumstances and conduct that constitutes rule violations, substances, and methods, rather than the ARCI classification of class 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and violations A, B, C, D. The substances, they'll be divided into primary and secondary substances. This is something that's taken directly from USADA. They don't really define these things, but they do define primary substances. And incidentally, the actual term medication is never defined in any of these rules, so we're not sure what the medications are here. In section 3, this is a little bit of a concern, although it's a legal concern. Instead of using absolute liability, or the absolute sure rule, they use something called strict liability. So that means that the agency or the authority has the burden of proving that a violation has occurred. However, and this affects the horseman kind of quite a bit, and that is all analytical methods, minimum reporting limits, thresholds, screening limits, decision limits, or any other reporting requirements that are approved by the Commission, and in this case, Commission is the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, are presumed to be valid and not subject to challenge. So those of you that have seen me sitting up here complaining about the RMTC method of determining the thresholds, all of these thresholds that they adopt are not subject to be challenged. So even though it's a somewhat better liability standard, the strict liability instead of absolute liability, technically we can't challenge the most important thing, which is where they came up with a 2 nanogram level for whatever. And the only defense that's listed is if it can be shown that the laboratory deviated from the laboratory standards. And having reviewed at this point dozens and dozens of laboratory tests, there's a lot of errors that laboratories have that even if they stuck to their own standards. Additionally, and this is something that we're somewhat familiar with, the prohibited list. The prohibited list includes those substances determined by the Commission, which is the Federal Trade Commission, in its sole discretion So no input from us that medical, veterinary, or other scientific evidence or experience supports the actual or potential ability to impact performance, the actual or potential ability to mask other substances, and the actual or potential detrimental impact on horse welfare. So they don't have to have scientific evidence, and they can use potential, the potential that there's a problem. Since the FTC has actually no actual expertise to make these determinations, it is likely going to adopt 100% without due diligence or independent investigation whatever is proposed by horse racing authorities' medication committee, which is at this time dominated by the RMTC. And we've been dealing with the RMTC for a long time now. We know what they do. You know, all hope for those that were in favor of federal regulation and common sense would accompany the federal regulation. That's all lost with this proposed section. A number of medications and methods have already been banned or misclassified based upon the RMTC's discretion that there might be a remote, unproven, and unestablished reason that these substances have the potential to either affect performance or the welfare of the animal. And examples of wildly inappropriate classified substances are metformin. We recently had a metformin in Kentucky. It's a 2B, and it was classified because so metformin is the #1 most prescribed diabetes drug in the United States. And it's actually occasionally administered to horses, but not racehorses, as a therapeutic medication. And because it's the #1 prescribed diabetes medication for people, there are probably at least 100 research projects that have been conducted to determine the effect of metformin on exercise. And they've looked at it in young adults, old adults, adults with impaired function in any number of ways. And there is one paper in rats that metformin improved performance. And all of the other dozens and dozens of papers, it actually does the opposite. It impairs performance. And yet, because of this one paper out of hundreds, the ROTC Scientific Advisory Committee chose to classify it as a 2B when it should be a 4C irrelevant, contamination positive. So that's just one example. Other wildly inappropriately classified substances are CBD. CBD is cannabidiol is identified in horses that eat hay that has been contaminated with hemp. And a number of states, wild hemp is a big problem. It's a super big problem in Nebraska. And don't buy your hay from Nebraska. So, you know, we have pictures of hay fields in the state that I'm not supposed to mention that, where the hay has been cut, and all around the edges of the hay field are hemp plants. So it's the biggest state for feral hemp. Medroxyprogesterone, I had a veterinarian call me from Florida saying this horse was at the farm and it got medroxyprogesterone. That is something that is administered to typically the colts that are on layup at home so that the horses are more readily manageable by the people who are trying to handle them at the farm. And so, and it's also administered to fillies to prevent them from coming into heat. Well, that was banned. And it tests positive for at least 10 months that we know of. And so I had a veterinarian call me and say, this horse needs to race, is it a go, or we'd like to put it in a go. It got this medroxyprogesterone on the farm. And I was like, I think they're racing at Mohawk in Canada, because that's the only option you have for that horse, is to go north. That's it. So, again, we already have wildly inappropriately classified substances. At this time, even though we fail most of the time, we are at least able to bring classification. With HISA, we don't have that option. We have no ability to help our federal authorities determine how drugs should be classified. So they have a race day and out of competition. They've gone ahead and banned, and ARCI just put a lot of restrictions on thyroxine. There's a lot of restrictions on clenbuterol, currently banned in Arkansas, other states. The HISA just goes ahead and bans those things straight up. It bans Serapin or P-block. I'm not sure if the horsemen know what that is, but that's what we use most typically for horses with back pain or horses with suspensory desmoitis. These are conditions that don't risk catastrophic injuries, and it's not a very good block, meaning it just dulls the pain a little bit so that the horses can train. It doesn't put horses at risk for catastrophic injury. Banned with HISA. So we did, when the anabolic steroid issue came up at ARCI, we were at least able to get a 6-month withdrawal plan put in place so that we could still use anabolic steroids. We raised geldings. There is no corollary to that in human sports. We don't castrate any of our human athletes before competing. So if a gelding is something severe like pleural pneumonia, severe diarrhea, these are things that we typically would treat with anabolic steroids. We didn't like the 6-month withdrawal, but at least we had that. Banned. Straight up banned. Intra-articular injection with stenozolol at doses well below any possible systemic effect has shown to be quite valuable in a number of conditions. Banned. Straight up. Clenbuterol, banned, straight up. I want to spend just a second on thyroxine. Thyroxine is a required hormone for bone remodeling. In other words, the appropriate laying down of bone while you're in training. Required. A lot of young horses under stress are low. One of our endocrinologist friends, Bob Douglas, has indicated that right about the 6 to 8 week point when a 2-year-old's been in training and starting to work and breathe, low thyroxine is a stress response that they have hypothalamic pituitary suppression from stress, and it decreases their cortisol. It also decreases their thyroxine. When are they shin bucking? When are they at risk of bucking their shins and potential saucer fractures? Fractures, remember fractures, that's a big bad thing we're trying to avoid. 6 to 8 weeks when they're starting to breathe. So that's one of the reasons a lot of veterinarians would add this to those horses, especially if they tested them and they were low. So a complete straight up ban of this therapeutic could actually increase the risk of fracture. And I put these 2 pictures in because that's the usual dose. This is the dose that was used and shown to cause heart arrhythmias, and it's the risk of heart arrhythmias that prompted the RMTC to want to ban this drug. And as you can see, nobody's feeding that to their horses. Nobody. More interesting is arrhythmias may also be caused by low circulating thyroxine. And I just thought this was interesting. The TDN reported that when they sent the blood sample to Cornell from Medina Spirit, who died of sudden death, which was presumed to be a heart arrhythmia, they couldn't find any thyroxine in his blood at all. And they commented, well, we don't know what that means in the dead horse. Actually, you're wrong, because it's been long established that there's no difference between thyroxine in blood from a live animal or a post-mortem sample. So, more smoke and mirrors, but could that have contributed to the sudden death of Medina Spirit? We all know that Bob Backer was accused of having a lot of horses die of sudden death And there was a suggestion that it might be related to the thyroxine administration to those horses. And ever since that time, Bob Appler has not had any thyroxine in his barn, and maybe, at least in this horse, maybe he should have. So, the HISA proposal simply bans thyroxine straight up. Incidentally, the World Anti-Doping Association does not ban thyroxine. So I'm gonna flip past these for time, and then comment that they have a prohibited list where they prohibit substances within 48 hours of racing and workouts. So that is in the act that was passed by Congress, that the authority is going to determine what can and cannot be given within 48 hours prior to a race. And so they've actually banned all substances, but they give you an exception. Normal, food and water, which is not defined, orally administered glucosamine and chondroitin sulfate, orally administered vitamins, anti-ulcer medications like Gastrogard, and electrolytes, but only sodium potassium chloride, and Regimate in fillies. So this is within 40 hours of a race or a workout. So that means supplements that horses are receiving on a daily basis. 48 hours of a race or a workout can't have any of those things. This is everything. This is everything. They put everything on that list. So you can't give anything to horses within 48 hours of either a race or a workout. So normal is not defined in HISA. Most joint products are combined with other things such as MSM, yucca, avocado, orally administered vitamins. You know that horses are given vitamin quote-unquote jugs prior to racing because it's appetite stimulant. So we're trying to get them to eat. So if they're not going to eat, they're certainly not going to eat vitamins in their feed. And then every commercial electrolyte product includes not just sodium potassium chloride, but trace minerals. And the purpose of that is to replace minerals lost in sweat. And then usually there's sugar, which is to improve intake. So there's a lot of things that they got wrong. So that's at least part of my review. And I'm going to hand this off to Dr. Tobin to talk about the balance of the document.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to review the HISA regulations as proposed with regards to therapeutic medications and endogenous dietary and environmental substances. The HISA document that we reviewed is basically silent when it comes to regulating how it's going to regulate these substances. And it seems that the document on the web, is largely a USADA product, and review of the USADA website where Mr. Tigert answers questions concerning aspects of medication control are quite interesting. The actual HISA document is essentially silent with regards to therapeutic medications, dietary and environmental substances. But on the USADA site, you can see that Tigert has used the phrase legitimate therapeutic medication. He uses that. Research is being done to ensure as complete and robust of a guidance document as possible and will be publicized well in advance of the new rules effective date. So basically what I'm saying there is there's a complete schedule coming, but it's not here yet. He was asked about genuine contamination. Answer, in these situations, consequences for the covered horse will be disqualification, and then bracket, if applicable, to ensure the integrity of the race. He's left that one sort of open. It's a little disturbing that when a covered horse tests positive for a primary substance, the responsible person will be provisionally suspended, rather than the matter being completely resolved, completely adjudicated before the suspension. If your horse needs a legitimate medication, this is an interesting answer. Check the list or with USADA. And the last comment he had on the website were guidance on the use of therapeutic substances prohibited on race day is being developed and will be published well in advance of the new list of prohibited substances going into effect. So basically, he's saying that he's recognizing legitimate therapeutic medications and environmental substances, and saying that there was going to be a very detailed description of the regulations in this area. When we look at the wording on the wording involved, the Act considers screening limits with thresholds for endogenous substances. And basically, a screening limit is an in-house limit that the chemist has. He screens the sample, and if it comes in below the screening limit, he doesn't proceed further. If it comes in above, he proceeds to confirm it. But he does not have to either share the screening limit or report the quantity in the confirmation. If it triggers a screening limit and goes ahead for confirmation, outside the United States, they simply confirm it and that's it, which is a little unusual. But nevertheless, the fact that he has a screening limit suggests that they're going to have regulatory limits. One of the interesting things that happened this spring was on February the 15th, a lady named Lisa Lazarus, an attorney, became the body's chief executive officer of HISA. What is interesting about Ms. Lazarus is that for a number of years recently, from 2018 to date, thank you, she was an attorney with Morgan Sports Law in London, England, and she was defending horse persons before the FAI. So she has most recently worked as a defense attorney, which I think is quite interesting. With regard to therapeutic medications, endogenous, dietary, and environmental substances, well, one more. Sorry. Oh, okay. There's a discrepancy. Okay, thank you. With regard to therapeutic medications, endogenous, dietary, and environmental substances, the approach is a defined cutoff period. Specific concentration limits on sensitivity testing are a long-established requirement. Each limit is substance-specific. For a therapeutic medication, it's determined by the dose and the withdrawal time. For an environmental substance, it is determined by the environment, or what's in the environment. And the only way you're going to find out what's in the environment and will show up in the horse is to actually measure, quantify, and report the quantity that shows up in the horse. So laboratories, in my opinion, should be required to always present both the identification and their best good faith estimate of the concentration. The chemist will say that we cannot rigorously quantify every substance, and basically that is definitively correct, but the best good faith concentration of the substance is an absolute requirement. And if you get that, you can begin to make some decisions about the levels in either plasma or urine that are pharmacologically or forensically significant. I'm going to speak about one that has showed up across the world in the last 3 to 4 years, synephrine. If you look at the molecule in the lower right-hand corner there, that's adrenaline or epinephrine, and that's what makes us tick. That's what keeps us rolling. We've got that in our bodies. And the TEF-A plant makes a rather similar molecule, and it's found to be useful. And the TEF-A came out of Africa, and it came to our attention when a lady, a show horse competitor, brought her horse to South Africa to complete and the testing of the samples was performed in England. Now, the English probably had not seen a lot of synephrine in the samples coming in from England and Europe, but it turns out that in South Africa and in South African hay, there are relatively large concentrations of synephrine, and the South Africans had an in-house regulatory threshold of 50 nanograms per ml of urinary cutoff for synephrine in horse urine. And what we did, and one of the things that I'm doing my best to do on behalf of the industry, is when we get a circumstance like this, where there is a clear substance that's creating a problem, and there's an identified regulatory threshold, I try to put it in the scientific literature as rapidly as I can. So I review the case, describe it as a case report, and it was just published in January of this year. So now there's a record out there that synephrine at 50 nanograms per ml is, in some parts of the world, is considered irrelevant. And that story also holds in Australia. I'm sitting in my office in fall of 20, I can't remember what year, the last year or two. I got a call from Ireland. A number of zilpaterol identifications have showed up in France. Now, zilpaterol is related to clenbuterol. It's used in cattle as a feed additive as a partitioning agent to increase the muscle and reduce the fat. And it's put into molasses, and the molasses is then put into the cattle feed, and that's how it gets into the cattle. And it's widely used in countries across the world. And we suddenly, in an Irish feed mill, feed plant, had been producing feeds and shipping them to France, and they were showing up with zilpaterol positives. Now, if you look back at the history of zilpaterol, it first showed up in, let's go to the zilpaterol clusters. It first showed up in California in 2013. There was 48 horses, and it was associated with an inadvertent transfer of molasses containing zilpaterol to horse feed. That was in the spring, April, I believe, of 2013. In June, they began to show up in Hong Kong, and it was the same feed mill, the same source, and it took 3 months for the feed to be shipped from California to Hong Kong, and then it began to show up in Hong Kong racing. And in both of those jurisdictions, it was decided that the horsemen were innocent, and there were no penalties against the traders as such. Everything is quiet for 5 or 6 years, and in 2019, we have a situation in Mauritius, in the Indian Ocean, which is the second oldest jockey club in the world. The stewards there, for some reason, started out-of-competition testing of horses for zilpaterol. They found 24 of them, and it turns out that the feed in Mauritius was being shipped in from South Africa. And before they made the announcement, they contacted the South African authorities, and there was a warning went out to South African horsemen about zilpaterol. So everything is quiet until the fall of 2020, when I got the call on the French positives, and I was asked by the company involved in Ireland to do a video presentation on zilpaterol, and it was about 24 hours notice, and I did some real fast homework. I gave them a brief presentation that was ultimately translated into French and presented in the European community. There were 80 or so horses, and many of them were withdrawn from racing because of these zilpaterol identifications. And it turns out that the source of the zilpaterol in the Irish feed was a product, molasses, that had been shipped from South Africa to Ireland and incorporated into the Irish feed, and it inadvertently contained some molasses, just like the feeds that were shipped from South Africa to Mauritius in the Indian Ocean a little earlier had also contained zilpaterol. One of the interesting things about this particular circumstance was that the testing for zilpaterol in Mauritius was much more sensitive than in South Africa, which accounts for the reason of the identifications. And similarly, the testing in France was more sensitive to testing in England, because the Irish fees contaminated with traces of silpanorol went to England. There were basically no problems, although a number of people withdrew their horses as a precaution. The outcome of this has been quite interesting. The FEI has created a new classification of chemical identification. It's called an atypical finder. And this means that they carefully review the source of the identification, and in some cases they will warn the horsemen, and if there's an identification associated with a definitive identification of feed contamination, there will be no penalties. Okay? There are two other things. How are we doing for time? I've got 5 minutes. There are two other things I want to speak about, two medications. Let me just get my, I don't have these on slides, I never got around to them. There have been a number of gabapentin identifications in Ohio racing in the last 2 or 3 years. These are generally less in plasma than 2 nanograms per ml in plasma. The Ohio authorities started calling them, and they kept coming. In other words, the horsemen did not know where these gabapentins were coming from. Gabapentin is a very widely prescribed human medication. The dose to a human is 3 grams. Now, the dose of to a horse is 2 to 3 grams. So anytime you see 3 grams going into a human, that's a lot of medication going into a human. It's quite unusual that the substance is not metabolized. So a person putting 2 to 3 grams of gabapentin into their mouth will urinate out about 2 to 3 grams per day. And if it's in or around a horse stall, you have a problem right there. We looked at the pharmacology of the drug and the concentrations. If you're giving 3 grams to a human, the concentrations to produce an effect are rather high. So we suggested a 5 nanogram per ml irrelevant threshold, a relevant concentration of gabapentin, and we put that in an article in the Horseman's Journal. I was pleased to see in some of the documentation that was produced that the Ohio authorities had requested an opinion from their expert, and he suggested 8 nanograms per ml. So basically what we've done is we've got on the record a irrelevant concentration cutoff for gabapentin, and we have supporting information from a racing authority expert. The last one I want to mention is the one that's in the winter issue of the HBPA, which is quite interesting. Let me just get my iPad open here so I can face ID, come on face. Amicar, aminocaproic acid. We had a number of a number of jurisdictions switch to industrial laboratories. Industrial laboratories has extremely sensitive testing technology, and a sequence of amicar identifications came up. I went back into my files and I dug out some Canadian data from a way back at amicar, and I looked at the pharmacology of amicar. And when we wrote the story in the Horseman's Journal, this winter issue, we reshuffled the curve from the Canadian data showing that the concentrations of amicar going into horses were very high, and we also showed a very long terminal half-life. It drops off rapidly at first, and then it's much more slow, and you can have a detection out to about 8 days. And we calculated an irrelevant plasma concentration of about 60 nanograms per ml, and I understand, and this is correct, that the RMPC has suggested a 65 nanogram per ml irrelevant concentration. So it's on, we have published it in the Horseman's Journal, we've got it out there, and as soon as I can get to it, I'll make sure it gets presented in the scientific literature. So basically that's where we are. The HISA rule on therapeutic medications, dietary environmental, endogenous dietary environmental substances is still to be written and still to be detailed, working away with Dr. Fenger and our colleagues here, doing our very best to get irrelevant thresholds published in the scientific literature to serve as a guideline to the industry going forward in this area. Ladies and gentlemen, it is 11:59. We're due to finish at 12. I thank you very much indeed for your attention and for your research support over the years. Thank you indeed.
Two important things that I need to talk about before we break. And if you have any questions, I think the panel would be willing to stand around and answer questions, so we're not going to do that in public forum. But I want to note that what you read about ISA in terms of medication today has not been put out by the FTC yet. We need to make that very clear. It was in draft form. It was for comment, but has not officially been put out. And I also want to make very clear that at the current time, USADA is not involved with ISA. They said their contract negotiations broke down, so the comments from Tiger are still on the website. We suspect that may be a reassociation, but currently USADA is not involved with ISA. So what we have press in the room, I want to make sure that we get that clear. The second thing that I want to do, and this is very important, Dr. Coburn's work is vital for horsemen around the country, and he doesn't just do it on behalf of organizations, he does it for individual horsemen as well, and it's very beneficial for Tom if we financially support that effort by making out checks to the Gluck Equine Research at the University of Kentucky, and you can talk to Tom about how to make those out so he gets credit for them. But if we contribute $15,000 a year as the Ohio HBPA, and I encourage any organization that has the ability to help Dr. Tobin out in that manner, because he helps countless horsemen out throughout the years and helps us all with the environmental contamination, establishing those thresholds. And one more push for financing. Claire and I both sit on the Equine Health and Welfare Alliance board. It's a 501c3, and the research that we're talking about for Dr. Keegan and innumerable other research projects are funded through that Equine Health and Welfare Alliance. So if you have funds for that, I encourage you to help that organization out as well. Thank everybody for sticking around, and I'll turn it back over to Eric briefly for announcements about this afternoon.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you again for the panel, Dr. Keegan, Dr. Tobin, Dr. Finger. Thank you guys for being here, sharing the vital information for us. Again, just education, that's what it's about. We need to make sure we're informed and continue to push for a path for science to guide us, not politics. So